This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Black Market Leadership. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, do we have a show for you? I am very excited to have our guest, Don Watkins. Now, Don, I could spend the next hour going over all your successes in your resume and all the great work you've done. So I'm going to try to encapsulate or at least summarize it. But if you're interested, people, please go to Wikipedia and you'll see Don's bio there. He is an American writer. He's also an objectivist and a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. That's from 2006 to 2017. He's also worked for the Center of Industrial Progress. And now he's a freelance writer. And he does some really, really great stuff, especially in the realm of liberty, free markets, rational egoism, which we're going to talk about today. I'm really, really happy. And by the way, he has 3 books right now on Amazon, as it says on Wikipedia. If I'm wrong, please tell me. But there's the Free Market Revolution, how Ayn Rand's ideas can end big government. There's another book I have right here in my office, Equal is Unfair, with America's misguided fight against income inequality. And latest, In the Pursuit of Wealth, the moral case for finance. Mr. Don Watkins, thank you so much for being on Black Market Leadership.
Thanks for having me.
Did I miss anything there?
I do have another book called Roosevelt Care, How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance.
Oh.
But I figure Wikipedia just might have missed that one. So.
Oh, what? Oh, Lord. Roosevelt Care. Here it is. Roosevelt Care. It's hidden. How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance. I feel like we could spend an entire episode or 2 on that. That's exciting. That is exciting. So for the audience here, the topic is something that I think is incredibly important. And frankly, I don't hear a lot about it, especially in leadership development today. And that is the topic of worldview. And this is a deep, now tell me if I'm right, Don. See, for the audience here, I've spent many hours reading Ayn Rand. I've spent a lot of hours on the Ayn Rand Institute on some of their courses. So I'm talking to a master here, the man here who really knows the philosophy in and out. So I'm kind of an amateur philosopher, if I can even say that. A worldview really is a philosophical perspective, almost like a cognitive outlook on the universe. Is that right, Don?
Yeah, I mean, we've all had the experience of like different people see the world differently, right? Or you could even think about in terms of like reading a book, you're entering an artist's world and you're getting a different way of seeing human life. And what philosophy is, it's the science that studies worldviews. It studies the kind of fundamental questions that when people articulate different answers, it constitutes a way of viewing the basic nature of reality, of human beings, and of our relationship to reality.
So I have an example here. And one example is I've heard Americans, whether it's our history, our founding values, how we've grown up, Americans, generally speaking, you could say maybe are optimistic, good-willed. We see that we know we can do things in the world. You know, Don, you could do anything. You and I might accept that. But I've also heard that people, like, for instance, in Russia, do not have that kind of worldview. That they may take that kind of speak as they just wouldn't believe it. They come off. I'm trying not to generalize, but my point is, different nations, different cultures can perceive different things very differently. Does that even make sense?
Totally. So individuals can have different worldviews, but what you definitely see is kind of a clustering of worldviews within any culture, and any particular individual might kind of like bow out of it and say, no, I view the world completely differently. But there's certainly kind of a concentrated worldview in any given culture. And certainly one thing that one has to be aware of if you're a human being, but particularly if you're in the realm of business, is if you're entering a different culture, you have to think, there's a different worldview going on here. And you can even think of it in more concrete ways. I lived in Japan for 2 years when I was younger. And one of the striking things that you realized was, wow, stuff that I thought was just the way human beings did stuff or the way human beings thought were up for grabs. So here's like a very kind of marginal example, but I think it's revealing. It's just, how close should you stand to somebody when you're talking? And it's, you grow up in a country and you think that's just kind of intuitive and given, and you realize, no, there's differences. And that's actually what philosophy is doing. What philosophy is doing is it's taking the things that we all take for granted and bringing to the surface that they're based on certain assumptions about what's true, assumptions about how we should act. And it's allowing us to self-consciously question those. And what you see in different cultures, if you think actually the origin of philosophy came about when different cultures started interacting more. So you had the ancient Greeks who they were very much interacting with other cultures through trade. And so it became a real question suddenly. Before then, it's just, we have our gods, we have our way of doing things. This is what's noble, this is what's not. And now suddenly it's, well, they pray to different gods and they have a different view of what's right and wrong. And they have a different view of how humanity got started. Which one is true? Like now we have to solve this problem. Whereas before we just thought this is, what human beings do when they stand and talk to one another. And so that's the real value, is to be able to identify what are the assumptions that people are making at the deepest levels, and then how do we answer which of those assumptions are true. Now, in some case, it's just optional, right? Like how far you stand. There's not a right or wrong answer to that, and you just kind of accept the cultural norms as given. But in other cases, there really is a right or wrong way, and you want to have the right answer rather than the wrong answer. So if you have a country that's like North Korea that says, no, we're going to take away every ounce of freedom, no matter the fact that we're starving the culture and robbing people of the ability to flourish, like that's wrong. You don't want to reach the answers that are endorsed by a culture like that.
Yeah. One of the most important lessons I have ever learned from ARI, and I use it today, even when I teach military history, I use this. I'm not sure what it's called, but it's the philosophy model. It's why called. And I remember a long time ago watching a video with Dr. Leonard Peikoff. And for the audience here, I'm going to explain this, but he drew an X. And on the 4 tips of this X were actually disciplines within philosophy. And in the center is the 5th discipline. On the two bottom, you have one called metaphysics and one called epistemology. And that metaphysics, for the audience, is basically your view of the universe, the world. For instance, for the audience, is there just one world, or is there different worlds, multiple worlds? Do you live in a benevolent world, like the world's just here, you can take advantage and do what you want, or is there another world and there's another power overseeing you? Do you have people and forces outside your control trying to really harm you or do you harm? That's a view right there called metaphysics. But if you take the other view, epistemology, how do you know that? Do you know it through reason, through scientific inquiry? Do you know it through mystical intuition? Or are you a complete skeptic and know nothing? When you take those 2 fundamentals, then you ask yourself, if this is my view of the universe and this is my view of knowledge, how do I live in this world? And that leads to ethics. I think if I'm correct, Aristotle, there's one world here. So therefore we live the best we can in it. But then you have Plato, who is basically the father of 2 worlds, the father of religion. Essentially, you have this world and you might say a heaven. The other world is much superior than this. So therefore I should sacrifice. I should do my best to live to ideal virtues, things not of this world. And I'm saying this to the audience because when you take those fundamentals, I would think those fundamentals are core in creating your worldview. Is the world for you or against you, or is it neither? How do you know it? And what should you do? Should you be happy? Should you be on guard? Are people against you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Russia before. So the philosopher that I'm most influenced by is Ayn Rand, whom you've mentioned. And she was born in Russia and came to the United States. And the philosophy she developed was fundamentally opposed to what you would think of as the kind of cultural philosophy of Russia. And I don't only mean communism, though she escaped from communism, but at a deep level, it was a society that held this view that there's 2 realities. So it was a very religious society, and it definitely had the character of the world is set against you, success is impossible, and it was your job is to kind of endure it. What's the word I'm looking for? Stoically. Like that's kind of the mental model of that culture. And part of what was appealing about the US culture for her was it was the idea of, no, the world is open to us. It's open to us if we use our mind, if we follow reason. We can tame a continent, we can create all kinds of technology that's going to lift our standard of living. We can solve our the diseases that kill us. We can make life better for human beings, and we don't just have to sit and kind of stoically bear it. So yeah, you're getting, I think, some really deep philosophical issues. But part of her view and part of my view is that, and what I'm trying to indicate is they have a huge import for how you live your life. Like these are not just kind of arcane questions that you debate in a classroom. Your answers to these questions are going to shape everything about your life and every aspect of your life, including, for instance, how you will conduct yourself in the business realm, how you will act as a leader, how you will face something like marriage and raising children. Like these are really crucial questions, which is why you want to raise those assumptions, make them explicit, and then really think about them.
You mentioned Stoicism. I don't know what's happened in the past couple of years, but there's this big, I don't know if there's a massive sale of Stoic books. In fact, there's one called, I think, The Obstacle is the Way. I remember reading it a couple of years ago. I enjoyed it, but I'm seeing this real push for Stoicism. Could you give us just a brief, understanding what is Stoicism and why is it? Let me back up. If the business world is, I would say, if the business world is about this world and it's about trading goods and services for rational selfishness, you're happy, I'm happy, we're traders. How does a philosophy that deals with two worlds? I'm assuming Stoicism is about duality. We have this world in the superior realm. What's this philosophy about, and how would that shape one's worldview?
Well, Stoicism is complicated in part because there's a lot of thinkers and it's not clear who is in effect representative. But I'll say this much. So I totally get the appeal of it in a sense, because if you read kind of the popularizing of Stoicism, like Ryan Holiday, whose book you mentioned, it's really about any endeavor, any quest for excellence involves a lot of hardship, challenges, setbacks, and how do you cultivate the kind of mental attitude that gives you the fortitude to push through those. And so it's in a way drawing on a certain philosophy. But if you take the actual philosophy, the basic idea is that, life is suffering. And in effect, what you should strive for is not success, happiness, and joy. But what you should, in effect, do is detach yourself from the world, detach yourself from having ambitious values, from sinking your teeth into the things you want and going on a quest for happiness. And in effect, make your peace with the fact that there's a lot of suffering. And the idea is you don't suffer as much if you're not invested in positives.
It seems to me, how you're describing Stoicism, it's almost, would it be fair to say it's not about, in business speak, there's surviving versus thriving. It's almost a survival mentality. I'm not here necessarily to thrive and to create new things. I'm here just to survive the world and do the best I can within it. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's complicated in part because the popularizers aren't really putting it forward as a real philosophy. And indeed, in many respects, it's not a full philosophy. It's sort of kind of a certain ethic with a kind of hint of underlying metaphysics and epistemology. But what I would say is this: part of what I urge people is don't leap to the conclusion that you shouldn't be on a quest for positives, that you shouldn't be fully invested in happiness, because contrary to the kind of Stoic sort of view, there's actually like a bunch of Hollywood movies that sort of have this theme of, well, the easiest way to avoid getting hurt is to just give up. The easiest way to avoid failure is not to seek out success. And though I don't think it's sort of openly preached from the Stoic perspective that that's what you should do. I think that's the kind of world outlook that's at work there, is one that says our whole aim in life, or our obsession, should be, how do I avoid feeling bad if things go bad? And I think that's really dumb. I think what you should be aimed at is, what's required for things to go good? And then I'm going to go out and make them go good. And this gets back to, well, I'm making a certain assumption, aren't I? That the world is open to human success and achievement. And yeah, I'm making that assumption, though it's not just a blind assumption. It's something that you can argue for and explain philosophically and defend philosophically. And so this gets again to why having an explicit, thought out worldview is important, because you really need to think about, is success open to human beings? And your answer, different answers will lead to very different lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have an example. So for the audience here, Don and I were just talking prior, and I said, I have a couple of military history examples. I have one example that is it's probably my favorite. In fact, when I teach the course, the students say this is their favorite. And this is really the connection between progressivism, fascism, and tanks. It sounds like a good book. But after World War I ends, look, I think 10, 11 million people died. It was whole soldiers died. It was a horrific bloodbath. And, the world would just cringe at just all this unnecessary blood of 4 years of fighting. Well, there were military thinkers who saw this. And one of them was a very famous thinker called J.F.C. Fuller. He was really the patriarch of armored warfare, of tanks, of panzers, of the Blitzkrieg, for all you World War II aficionados out there. But he, again, you talk about philosophical, just a big jumbo soup. He was both he was a pagan, he was an anti-socialist, but though pro-socialist, he was all over the place. But what some of these thinkers, but most of all, he was a fascist. He just really believed in one government. But what's so interesting in terms of a worldview, how a worldview can affect your decision, your planning, and your outlook, was fascists like Fuller. They saw World War I as just an utter bloodbath, but they saw the millions of people that died, the millions. And now try to follow this logic, Don. If all those millions represent quantity, well, who else in the world likes quantity? The materialists, the people in capitalism. We all like all our things. So he said World War I, like these other fascists, was really the effect of capitalists. They were bringing all this idea of quantity, of material things to the battlefield, but it was also against quantity of people, meaning the masses. He thought the masses of people were just naturally dumb, that they were just not smart. But who was a smart? It was that small elite, kind of going back to Plato's philosopher king, the one or two or very few people who had that superior education, who knew true reality, who knew what real knowledge was. Don't mind these dumb asses. It's this few who know. So you take this idea that the quantity is bad and warfare leads to disaster, and you take the idea of the quantity of people cause this. Well, what's the solution? And this is where they would put an emphasis on technocrats. We don't need these masses of people. We need these small elite people running government to create technology. And guess what new technology came out of World War I? Airplanes, tanks. So you know what they would say? We need a small quality force, not quantity, but a quality force of tank troops, of tanks, tank artillery, followed by airplanes. And ultimately, instead of these big attacks, broad front attacks like you saw in World War I, they focused on strategies of taking this elite few of quantity, of quality and technical superiority, and punching just through lines and circling these big forces. And that fascist view, that worldview, actually shaped what Blitzkrieg came to be. And so it's funny for the audience here, when we talk about worldview, it really has an implication because it's affected military strategy and tactics for decades, over 100 years now. Pretty interesting.
Well,
huh?
Oh, totally. But I mean, it's one reason why it happened through several wars that Americans were underestimated. And part of why they were underestimated was they care too much about this, the Japanese particularly, they care too much about their lives in this world and their happiness. But I think the Germans had this kind of view as well. And and it was true. We didn't care about our lives and our happiness, but that's why we were willing to fight for it. But it's also why we were able to outproduce them. And it was that love of life and the ability to outproduce, that a concern with life on this earth and the freedom that protects it, that I think was the fundamental things that allowed us to triumph in those cases. So war reveals worldviews and is an expression of worldviews in many ways.
Yeah, a lot of these, the last example, I don't want to bore the audience with these military history examples, but the one of the most fascinating things is which you'll find is near the end of the 1800s, into the 19th century, this real focus on willpower, going back to Nietzsche, right? This idea of willpower. And it was so focused on that, even the French, prior to World War I, they would say, don't worry about the machine guns firing at you, Don. It's your fire in the belly. It's your spirit that will overcome it. Just charge them. And these nations would actually believe, they would actually incorporate that. Well, you know what? It's true. These capitalist societies like United States they're overwhelming with the tanks and airplanes. Doesn't matter. It's our willpower, the willpower of the German, of the Japanese soldier. We will overcome it. So that's why, what's the real effect? This is why the Germans made 1,365 Tiger tanks, superior tanks, 1,365 compared to 90,000 Sherman tanks, because they believed that elite few, in their worldview, it was the elite, the quantity that could overcome the material superiority. And that material, that's all about this world. We are spiritual Germans and Japanese, and we can overcome our enemy. And that was their downfall. That was their big, big downfall. So that worldview really, really has an impact on your decision-making. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because believe it or not, how you view the universe, is the universe for you, against you? Like you said earlier about Stoicism, are you here just to endure pain and avoid pain? Or are you there to thrive and bring out your best and be a success? That really, really, your views affect your actions and affects your happiness.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, we'll probably talk about this more, but it's worth drawing out, like, they're really, though this shows up starkly in war, and we can talk about it in an academic context, like, this is so much tied to business. Let me just give kind of one obvious sort of example, which is, how do you view other people and human relationships in general? So one kind of view might be that, well, we're all in fundamental conflict. Your interests conflict with mine and mine conflict with yours. So I have to do whatever it takes to get on top. Another one could be that, well, we have a harmony of interests, like you achieving your goals and me achieving mine. We both win out. And so what we should seek out is, hey, can we find mutually beneficial sorts of relationships? Or let's take an even more direct tie from the German example you're giving. If you have the view that basically human beings are mostly like hopeless and competent, but there's a few elites, well, that's going to lead to a very different perspective on leadership than that we're all independent individuals who are able to think, and that if we have a relationship where I'm your boss and you're my employee, you're not like my servant or underling. I have to treat you with respect. I have to be concerned with your goals. Are you actually achieving your happiness and pursuing developing the best of your talents? Is there this, are we focused more on hierarchical relationships where I basically have to like whip you into shape? So all of these kinds of assumptions and many, many others are going to make a huge difference in how one approaches business. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to think about. I mean, there's many reasons to think about these issues. In part, I mean, one of the things that we see is that business is very much under attack. As we speak, for like the 30th time in a year, tech CEOs have been hauled in front of Congress and threatened with antitrust and things. And so it's, well, how do you function in a culture that views your whole industry and the whole endeavor of business as fundamentally immoral? So there's philosophy, there's worldviews wrapped up so much in the area of business. And the part of the problem is everybody knows it except businessmen. And that's a very dangerous position to be in, because if you want to think about what's the competitive advantage of your attackers, it's that they know what game you're playing and you don't.
That's exactly, you know, I've always said this, and I'm probably gonna be very inarticulate in saying this, but I just want you to understand the gist of this. I've always thought that it's both I think it's been a great, I guess, benefit. It's probably not the right word. A great virtue of business in that you want to get things done. We're here to make things happen, get things done, and move. I like that. But I think one of the biggest vices with business is that they just want to get things done, and it's speed. Do it now. We don't have the time to just investigate, find a simple answer, and move forward. And I find that, and I know this is the big thing through the objectivist movement, in that, businessmen and businesswomen are some of the worst. They're their own worst enemies, because they will adopt ideas that I think look good, that provide solutions. But if you investigate them, they're just really self-sabotaging. It's almost like we want to get this solution. This looks good. I'm not going to investigate it, and I'm just going to jump to it. What do you think about that observation?
One of the really interesting things is, so one of the myths about business is that they're short term. But like, if you think about the people who created a computer revolution, they were thinking in terms of decades. We're going to start it. So this is at a time when it was like a handful of hobbyists who were soldering things, in their basements. And then you had like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates who said, no, there's going to be a computer on every desktop. And they didn't think like in the next 90 days and we're going to make $1 million and then, go like retire. It was, this is going to take a while and we're going to pioneer and make it happen. So there's that kind of long-term perspective. And yet what is true is that there's a kind of view that, well, we don't have to be concerned with ideas. We certainly don't have to be concerned with moral ideas. And what we need to do is kind of avoid controversy. And it's in this respect that business actually is short term. So they're long term in terms of actually running a business, but they're short term in really taking seriously that ideas are going to shape the environment in which they operate. So the way this comes up, I mean, there's many ways it comes up, but I'll just speak. I've worked with a lot of fossil fuel, oil and gas companies. And I think everybody knows there's a big contingent amongst people who want to see those companies destroyed and eliminated and wiped off the face of the earth. And one of the ways that they do so is through activist investing, where they'll basically say, well, we want you to do all sorts of things. We want you to basically to have an anti-fossil fuel person on your board, and we want you to stop drilling for oil and building pipelines and everything. And they'll put forward shareholder proposals aimed to kind of pursue this end. And the idea is, well, we don't want to be controversial. We don't want to make any of these people mad. Why don't we throw them a bone? In effect, why don't we, to take a military analogy, why don't we pull a Chamberlain and just kind of appease them, and that maybe they'll leave us alone? And what they're not seeing is that, no, they want you destroyed. And this small step is only going to embolden them. This concession is only going to embolden them, because you're unwilling to endure the controversy of saying, we think what we do is good. We think it promotes human life. We think we produce the best energy, taking into account the very real negatives. We think the benefits are overwhelmingly positive, and we're willing to take a controversial moral stand to say, no, this is right and it's wrong, the people who are attacking us. In the short term, yeah, that can be unpopular. You can get a bad New York Times headline. I mean, you're getting them anyway, but nevertheless. And yet, if you want to be long term, it's not just about drilling the right wells. It's about championing the right environment and the right policies that recognize your right to exist and the virtue of what you're creating. So it's a real challenge to be long-term. And the thing is that your attackers in business are often long-term, and businessmen typically want to kind of brush their hands of ideas, and particularly any moral ideas. And that is a huge, huge mistake.
It would seem to me, if I was to pinpoint, if I could try to pinpoint the the issue with that, I agree. I agree with you in terms of short term and long term, but to me, I would say that the pinpoint, I'm like, it's ethics. Who is the beneficiary of their actions? It's not them. It's not, there's no rational selfishness. There's no people saying we have a right to exist. This is a part of the earth, and we have a right to do this. Instead, it's apologies and apologies. That's at least how I'm reading it. That they don't want to stand up for themselves. I mention this because that's how we fight wars today. We don't win wars, by the way. The last war we won was 1945 and World War II. And that was a very, very different populace, a populace that was proud to be American, who stood up for their own values.
Yeah. So here's selfishness is a very tainted term. Now, I think in the end, the proper way to think about selfishness is it's rational, long-term, and it's mutually beneficial. That is you pursuing your happiness and me pursuing my happiness without either of us sacrificing the other or sacrificing for the other. I think that's the right way to live. I think everybody benefits. It's, if you think about business relationships, your buyer and seller, we're both benefiting, and it's not just financial, like we'll go out for drinks, we'll hang out, you build real human connection that way. I think that's the model of proper human relationships. That's very controversial. Let's think about it in a different way. Self-esteem. So to take why haven't we won wars? It's not because we weren't militarily competent to do it. It's because we were afraid to really defeat the enemy. Now, that's a whole big discussion, but I think it's really rooted in the idea of our culture. Our countries didn't have self-esteem. We didn't have the self-esteem that we have a right to exist, and anybody who attacks us has to be crushed. And any of the innocents caught in the middle, that is the result, and the moral blame goes to the people who initiated and put us in this position. So if you're Al-Qaeda and you kill us, 3,000 Americans, we have the right to defend ourselves, and any blood is on the hands of the people who started it. But there's a very real parallel to businesses, which is there's not a self-esteem in many cases. And the energy industry is a very good example there, because often they're so demonized as, oh, they don't care about the future of the planet. But I've met these CEOs, I've met the people who work in these companies, and often some of them do have real self-esteem in their industry and the importance of their industry. And in part because of the work that I did with Alex Epstein at the Center for Industrial Progress, I think this has gotten a lot better. But there was a real feeling of, well, people need this, but it's not really good. We should replace it as quickly as possible. And if you have the view of what you're doing is not good, or if you take an industry, a more not average, but if you take an industry that's not so unpopular, what are they usually attacked for? For profits. There's kind of this uncomfortable feeling of, well, do we really deserve this much money? Silicon Valley really wrestles with that.
Yeah.
If you don't have self-esteem, you're setting yourself up to be a victim of anybody who's going to use that against you. And that is not an unusual, it's not confined to business, it's not confined to warfare. If you look at how people are manipulated in just romantic relationships, it's often preying on a person who suffers from low self-esteem and feels like, well, yeah, he's hitting me or she's, manipulating me, but do I really deserve better? And so you really need to have self-esteem. And if you don't earn it, if you don't have it, earn it, because it's that lack that provides the opening in the door for attackers and exploiters. And if you do have self-esteem, then they don't have a way in. And so the question should be, well, how does one acquire self-esteem? And philosophy is really important there, because what philosophy tells you is what are the principles, the moral standards by which you should judge yourself. And so you should think deeply about those standards.
So if there's one thing that really just gets under my skin in the business world, especially in leadership, I just see these people crying about humility. But get this, Don, they're not saying be humble or modest. You know what they say? Don't be arrogant. That's their definition of humility, as if not dying is the same definition as living. I'm bringing this up because you talk about self-esteem. I find that sometimes people perceive self-esteem as being arrogant, but it's to me, it's the confidence. It's the confidence to stand up on your own 2 feet, do your own thing, be happy. If you have successes, claim them. Don't show excess, but don't show deficiency. And I think the one thing that just plagues the leadership industry, and I think it's because I don't know if it's guilt or whatever it is, but you got to be a humble leader. And I think to myself, who do you think Steve Jobs was? You think he was humble when he started this? You should read his bios. We need people with a vision. We don't need people who are, whipping you, as you said earlier, but we need people who have a great vision, who want to bring you aboard. And if you want to work with them, great. But I think this, you can probably tell this really gets under my skin, because I've seen a lot of great leaders out there. I think they're great, but when they say this humility thing, I'm like, my God, where's the self-esteem there? I want to follow someone great. I want to be great. I want to follow a great person. I don't want to follow Joe Modesty over there. That's just boring, at least in my book.
Yeah, this is such an interesting issue, because look, it is super plausible in this way. What I think people are groping for when they talk about being humble is being objective. So this is what good leaders see. They look around and they see people who are unwilling to accept criticism, unwilling to admit when they're wrong, just assuming that because I think it must be so. And then they run flat and fall flat on their face. And they think, well, I don't want to be that guy. And it'll get conceptualized as they weren't humble, they were arrogant. There's a Greek word I always forget, so I'm not going to remember it. But it's the basic idea is, well, that's bad, so humble might be the right alternative. And I think the right alternative is to be objective. It's to say, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, this is what I kind of know, this is what I suspect, and to recognize that part of objectivity is I want as much feedback from the world, because I know I only know so much, and that I almost certainly have blind spots. It's if your approach is objective, then you're confident about the things you know, you are honest about the things you don't know, and that you're sort of know, and you make your decisions accordingly. Now, there is a real issue of I wouldn't quite call modesty a virtue, but I think this is what I think happens. If you look at the best people and the smartest people, this is a tendency, it's not a universal. They are arrogant when they're young and modest when they're older. And I'm not, and rightfully so. And I mean it in this sense. When you're young, if you're going to accomplish anything, you have to have a confidence in yourself that even though it's not yet proven, right? Like, you have to have this idea of, yeah, even though I haven't actually done this, I'm pretty sure I can create a better business than these people around me. I'm pretty sure that I know better than the guy who's running, a $200 billion company. And I think that's a totally legitimate thing. And so, like, I think youthful arrogance is amazing. But what happens is that over time you discover your limits. And I don't mean like you're kicked and told, oh, you don't know anything. No, you learn, okay, no, I'm really good at this. These are my limits. So if you think of Steve Jobs' arc, there's a lot of arrogance at the beginning, and part of what he discovers over the course of his career, and one of the kind of evolution of him, is discovering, yeah, I really did see ahead of my time. I really do know how to run companies. I really do know how to create great projects, but there's other things I didn't know, and I've learned them. And so what you got was somebody who was, I wouldn't exactly call him modest, but he was much more objective about what he was good at and what he wasn't. And I think that's what to strive for. What you should strive for is not arrogance or humbleness or modesty, but what you should strive for is objectivity. And that means knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, and knowing what you kind of know, and not pretending to know more than you know, but also not pretending to know less than you know.
I love it. I love it. So I have a question for you. I have a really good question for you. All right. This is a philosophical question. We're going to tie epistemology to our culture, meaning I feel like we live in a hand-to-mouth culture. And I say it through movies. I love watching movies, and boy, there's just some real, there's no themes, there's no great stories. It's just action here, action here. It's almost like it's just instant feedback, instant satisfaction, immediate satisfaction. And I feel like when you live in a culture which is just all about the instant feedback, I'm trying to think of the right term, having that kind of just instant gratification, constantly instant gratification, as you said earlier, short-term thinking, that's got to affect your worldview. Even I think if you were born with a very positive worldview and you live in just constantly with all this, hand to mouth satisfaction, that's got to, I think, lower your expectations. I don't know. Could that affect your certainty in yourself, your self-esteem? Are there any connections between those two?
Well, yeah, there definitely is. So if you think about like instant gratification versus what? Well, one kind of contrasting view would be kind of self-denial, right? Everybody wants instant gratification. No, it's self-denial. But there's a different conception, and this goes back to the Greeks, and you can think of it as virtue. So virtue is the idea of, in the Greek conception, it wasn't like this, it was not about self-denial. It was about that there's a good more than like the immediate, obvious kind of short-term fix that one can get from like eating a great, meal or, gorging yourself on food or alcohol or something like that. It was that, no, there's a right way to live. There's certain principles that should govern yourself. And it's living by these principles that are good for you, but they're long range good for you. If you think about something like honesty, yeah, you might be able to get a quick buck or like close a deal by telling a lie today. But, the Warren Buffett saying about, it takes a decade to build a reputation and an instant to lose it. Mm-hmm. I'm butchering that, but that's the basic idea. It's the idea of, well, no, honesty, long range really does get me to happiness, success, the kind of friends that I want, the kind of business that I want, the kind of financial results that I want. So what virtue is about is how do you take, what are the principles that long range will achieve your goals and achieve your happiness and give you self-esteem? Because in the end, true self-esteem comes from practicing virtue. It comes from saying, these are the principles that I live by, and I'm not going to be swayed by short-term, temptations and urges. Within virtue, I'm going to try to get all the pleasure that I can. So if I'm being honest, yeah, if I can have like a great time at the movies or, a great evening with my wife doing whatever is fun and pleasurable, like that's all great. But that I'm never going to veer off the road of virtue. And that is both the route to self-esteem. It's the route to success. And what it does is it provides the guardrails within which you can have short-term instant gratification without sacrificing the long-term. So you can have an amazing meal out at a wonderful dinner and even make an exception tonight for cake. But you know that you're headed in a positive direction. Whereas the kind of person who is not thinking about their future has no concern with virtue and therefore no conception of what are the kinds of activities and actions that are going to guide me in a long-term direction.
So in a sense, it's almost like pleasure versus happiness, right? Pleasure, the immediate, and happiness, the long-term. Is that the...
I wouldn't put it that way for two reasons. Number one, I don't see them generally at odds. Sometimes they may be at odds, right? Like I'm on a diet, my doctor says I will get a heart attack if I, don't stop eating sweets. So sometimes they can be at odds. So that's one reason. The other is the kind of conventional view of the pleasure seeker. I don't think they're actually after pleasure. I think often what it is, they're after an escape from suffering, and they're looking for a substitute for lack of self-esteem. And so it's the way that I think about it is you want as much pleasure as you can being on a long-range course of action. And that's what virtue is conceptualizing. And what you don't want is to take any short-range actions, which some people do, because they want the brownie. But often what people are seeking is to fill a lack of self-esteem. So if you think about like a criminal behavior, like people shooting somebody over some triviality, like, oh, he, bumped into me in line. I got to show him that I'm somebody. Not thinking about the fact that, oh, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison for this, right? But no, right. I got to show this guy I'm somebody. That is all I I feel like I'm a nobody. I'm trying to fill that lack of self-esteem with a momentary feeling of power. So I wouldn't think of it as an issue fundamentally of pleasure, though pleasure is relevant in terms of thinking about the relationship between the short term and the long term.
I don't remember. I don't remember what CD it was on the history of philosophy. I think taped in 1970 with Dr. Peikoff. The best, by the way, the best course I have ever taken, ever. It was the greatest investment I ever did. The history of Western philosophy. But when you say
it's on YouTube, yeah, Leonard
is it
Peikoff.
really?
Yeah, Peikoff, Peikoff, history of philosophy on YouTube, and you'll have hours and hours of the best starting point in philosophy you can get.
I'm shaking my head because I paid $800 for that damn course. I'm like, damn it, it's free now. Great course. If you're out there, you got to do it. But there was something in that course when you taught virtue. I'll never forget this. It was the ancient Greeks, how going back to worldview. The ancient Greeks, if I remember right, I don't think it was arete, the Greek word, but virtue meant manliness in the sense that you could go out and the world is yours and take it on and do what you want with it. And I mean, in a very positive sense. But then when Christianity took over, I guess during the Middle and Dark Ages, virtue it transformed from manliness to the virtue of a woman. And it's almost a very defensive. It almost went from an offensive, go out to the world, to a defensive, a very protective term. And does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah. So the basic idea is that the Greek perspective was that so they all took it for granted that the goal of morality was to teach us to achieve happiness. And there was competing ideas about, and that's not even exactly right, but there was a general consensus, you could say, that our goal should be happiness. And then there was a view of, well, how do you achieve happiness? And kind of the central constituent of a happy life, the thinkers held, was a life of virtue. And so virtue is a kind of strength. It was a kind of, it was a way of living that was pointing you in the direction of the best life, and the best life in the Aristotelian conception here on earth. And so when you get to Christianity, that you have a two-world perspective, right? And what virtue is aimed at is it's aimed at not this earth, but another world. And so the line that Leonard is talking about, that you were talking about with Leonard Peikoff, is like he's talking about the kind of switch from virtuous strength to virtuous chastity in a woman. Is really what it is it's a switch from virtue as a this worldly path to happiness to a deny happiness. Weakness on earth is good because in the next life it's going to be rewarded.
Got you. I have never forgot that lesson, because when I'm on LinkedIn, I see all these memes. I see, rarely do you see things about leadership, about vision, about people. The world is yours, go out and make it, which I love. It's kind of inspiring. But most of the things I see are there. It's almost very defensive. It's almost like, a good boss is this boss. In a sense, I'm hearing people, this is the wrong term. I'm hearing people cry. I'm hearing people like, God, this is not a cool workplace. What a cool workplace should look like is this. And it says people complaining. And I get the complaints. I get that. But when that's majority, at least in my opinion, when that's the majority of things I see dealing with leadership, that tells me there's a certain worldview of leadership, of your role, either being a leader or even supporting whatever. And I always think about that virtue example of those two of the Greek and the Christian. So,
yeah, well, let me say something about that real quickly, which is, so part of what philosophy teaches you is that what we're often presented with are false alternatives. And if you think about leadership, it's often the false alternative between the authoritarian leader who's telling everybody what to do, doesn't listen to feedback, doesn't care about the people he's in charge of. And then the alternative is this mealy-mouthed person who has no confidence, who's just like, I'm not in it for me. I don't care about my own quest for happiness, my own financial well-being. It's all about you and whatnot. And part of what philosophy gives you is think, okay, well, and what happens is an oscillation where one side, kind of dominates for a while, and then all the problems emerge with it. Like, hey, guess what? If we don't pay attention to our employees or care about them, we lose the best ones and it sucks. And then you go to the other side and you go, we have no leadership. We have nobody steering the boat. And it feels phony because we know that really this person wants the best for himself. He wants to make money. He wants to prosper. He knows more than we do, presumably, or he wouldn't be in this position. At least he knows more about kind of the high level integration of our work. And so part of what you want to be thinking about is, am I choosing between false alternatives, and what would another alternative be? And that's why I stress the idea of objectivity as an alternative. It's that I want a leader who's objective, who's going to make the decisions, who's going to exercise the judgment to figure out what's right, who's out to make the most of his life and make the most money as possible, but recognizes that happens from the success of the business and the success of his team or her team. And in order for him or her to succeed, they want the best information. They want to know what's true, not just, oh, this is what I happen to think. And so they're going to want feedback and things. So you need to learn how to question false alternatives. And part of that comes from learning how to think about worldviews.
I love it. Don Watkins, this has been a fantastic interview, a fantastic discussion. It really has, because I think, again, this is one topic which is not, I don't hear a lot about it, but I think we've dived into it in several different places. And audience, again, if you can't hear the applause, I assure you it's out there. People are golf clapping right now.
Any last post?
Any last words for the audience? Anything you want to tell, or where can people find you?
Oh, well, they can find me at donswriting.com. You'll see if you go to the website that it's talking about people interested in liberty, but a lot of what I do for my newsletter is just about communication and about kind of principles of communication and persuasion. And we didn't talk about this, but my whole background is business. I'm very interested in it. So if anybody has any questions about how does this apply to my job or something like that, feel free to send them to don@donswriting.com.
Excellent. This has been a fantastic interview. I promised you 2:00, and it's 2:00, my friend. Thank you so much for being part of Black Market Leadership. Have a great weekend, okay?
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile